hate to break it to y'all, but the truth is not always good for us. Yes, the truth is beneficial to us, maybe most of the time, definitely a lot of the time, but it's not always beneficial to us. It's not a refuge we can always feel safe in. These are clips from public figures speaking to this idea. The first coming from Donald Hoffman, who is a scientist and researcher. Take a look.
Whatever reality is, it's not what you see. What you see is just an adaptive fiction. Fitness is not the same thing as reality as it is, and it's fitness and not reality as it is that figures centrally in the equations of evolution. So in my lab, we have run hundreds of thousands of evolutionary game simulations with lots of different randomly chosen worlds and organisms that compete for resources in those worlds. Some of the organisms see all of the reality, others see just part of the reality, and some see none of the reality, only fitness. Who wins? Well, I hate to break it to you, but perception of reality goes extinct. In almost every simulation, organisms that see none of reality but are just tuned to fitness drive to extinction all the organisms that perceive reality as it is. So the bottom line is evolution does not favor vertical or accurate perceptions. Those perceptions of reality go extinct. Now, this is a bit stunning. How can it be that not seeing the world accurately gives us a survival advantage? That is a bit counterintuitive.
This is from a TikTok channel called Elite Motivation. They have a few people speaking to this idea.
You have to be crazy enough to think that it's possible.
Sometimes you have to create a delusion, even if you have to lie yourself into believing that.
That's how you do something worthwhile. You have to believe it's possible.
Complete delusion. You gotta believe the delusion because it's only delusional until it works.
Your mind is designed to help you get what you want. You just have to be willing to believe it's possible.
And when you believe something is possible, everything else will figure itself out.
Justin Prince also speaks to this idea.
University of Pennsylvania did a study, 22-year study, 350,000 people. And they found that a thinking pattern began to emerge over a 22-year period that was what they called predictive of success. So wouldn't you want to know if there was a way you could think that it would predict success, what was the thinking pattern? Guess what it was? It was optimism. They noticed that the optimistic people, it became a predictor of success. Now, here's what's interesting. Two characteristics they found in these optimistic people. One is that they had an unrealistic expectation that they were going to succeed. An unrealistic expectation. And by the way, let me pontificate for a minute. This is an academic studying you, right? They're studying Eric Worre, and they're over a 22-year period, and they're thinking to themselves, because you're telling them, they're doing the study, I'm going to accomplish this and all this visionary stuff. And guess what they're thinking? That's unrealistic. Unrealistic to who? In this case, to them, or maybe even unrealistic in the world.
Yep.
But it's not unrealistic to you. You're willing to go for it and chase it. That optimism or that visionary part. Second characteristic is they would try new things until they succeeded. So most people persist until it gets hard. They persist until the customer quits. They persist until the team member leaves. That team quits. They persist until that point. Where these optimistic visionary people will say, I'll just persist until I succeed.
Tony Robbins cites another researcher who studied this phenomenon.
Dr. Seligman is very famous for doing studies on optimism. And in those studies, you know what he found out? People that are pessimists are much more realistic. They're much more accurate. If you give them a test and you ask them to look at something and give you a size measurement of it, or to evaluate their own success or failure at a task, in every study Seligman's done, he did it in the University, I think Pennsylvania if I remember correctly originally, what he found was that optimists always see themselves as doing better than they really did. They basically BS themselves. What happens to pessimists, they're 10 times more accurate. But here's what he found out. What he found out is because the people who are accurate never push themselves because they know it's never going to work anyway. Whereas the optimist sees it better than it is, so they keep doing it. Because they have the illusion they did well, I'll do even better next time. And because of that optimism, they did it more often, and so optimists succeed at a 4 to 5-fold, depending upon the task, result ultimately beyond anything that a pessimist will do, and they're not as accurate. All that's a big way of saying is, if you can develop a psychology of resilience in yourself, you don't have to be optimistic or fake, you can be real. The realness is, whatever shows up, you are larger than anything that can happen to you.
Will I Am, the famous musician, speaks to this idea. Very interesting, his perspective.
I got out of my predicament because I didn't live in my current reality. Had I lived in my current reality, I would still be in my reality that was constructed for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to live in this realm that was dreamt of, and my whole premise was to manifest that dream with strategy. So I had to live as if it was real. I had to live like I already moved my mom out the projects. I had to live like this gang doesn't want me. I'm no use for this gang. Why even get initiated and live that gang life? Let me just keep wearing these suits because these suits that my mom made me are my attire for the world that I'm going to be living in. You have to live. If you living in some place that you know that you don't belong, you know you don't belong there. Why are you stuck in that?
Ken Gemis, a professor of philosophy, speaks to this idea as well.
In an everyday sense, we can see illusions as very, very important. Think about a sportsman. It turns out that most really prime sportsmen have incredible overinflation of their abilities. But that overinflation of ability, that illusion, helps them perform better. And to give a last case that is often given in epistemology classes, allegedly there are statistical evidence for the claim that if you are trapped behind enemy lines, let's say this was in the Second World War and the Vietnam War, you had, let's say, an 80% chance of being captured, right? But if you believed, I think of and I'm an American citizen, so I can say this without sounding anti-American. If you're extremely American gung-ho and you say, I'm the guy who's going to survive, that increases your chances of being, that means your chances of being captured. Before they were 80%, now they go down to 65%, let's say. I'm pulling these numbers out of the air. So on the basis of evidence, that is, if you're thinking merely epistemically, that is being sensitive to the evidence, you'd still think on the balance of probabilities, I'm going to be captured. But if you can get yourself over that belief through illusion and tell yourself, oh no, I'm not going to be captured, it has the pragmatic effect of lessening your chance of being captured. So you can see why it's in your best interest. So I'm just giving you these cases where in everyday life and in exceptional cases, it helps to have illusions. Illusions are necessary often to animate our activity.
Sam Harris has a guest on his podcast and they speak a little bit about this phenomenon.
There's this wide literature on things like, placebo and nocebo effects and, pain and functional illness being, in many cases, driven by one's expectations. You have a fairly arresting example in the book of just how far this can go. Yeah. I mean, we can take those in any order you want, but I'm thinking about pain and emotion and motor movement.
Yeah, I think where to start there? I think pain. Let's start with pain and then move along to emotion and movement. Yeah, I mean, you could think of pain in the same ballpark as emotion, but let's just start with simple pain. So, the idea there is that we're predicting not just the external world, but the signals from our own body all the time. In fact, you might think that predicting the signals from your own body is evolutionarily the whole important thing about this kind of structure, is that you're predicting how your body ought to be right now, and that helps to kind of, in a way that we'll describe in a minute, move your body around and adjust internal parameters and, start sweating and things like that, or go and get something to drink or something to eat in ways that keep those variables within the bounds of viability. So we kind of, we use predictions to make sure that we don't have to stray right outside the bounds of viability because something very painful is happening. But the moral of the story is for that particular sort of rather dramatic illusion of pain. And then you've got there's a little bit of overweighted prediction machinery in play. And there's a lot of interest in new therapies that are trying to target the predictions rather than anything else. So I think pain is, we all know this in a way. It's sort of, if the dentist says expect a tickle, they're saying that for a reason. They're trying to frame those sensations that you're going to get in a way that really will dampen the experience of pain just a little bit. And there are controlled experiments showing that expectations of intense pain will up the pain rating, and expectations of less intense pain will down the pain rating, even when what's being delivered is, an intermediate stimulus all those times. So I think pain's a good case, but it's just one that we all happen to know about. But all of our medical symptoms, all of our bodily experiences are built up in this way.
I just want to revisit the basic thesis again, because I know you clarified this at the outset, but I just want to make sure I have the true shape of it. So is the claim that we mostly consciously experience our predictions and are continually revising them in concert with attending to sensory inputs? Or is it that all we experience is our predictions, and that the sensory input is really always unconsciously modifying our predictions? And it's a, as Anil Seth called, a controlled hallucination, but it's the control component is always happening in the dark.
Yes, that's the way I see it.
And another researcher, Z-Dog on YouTube, actually cites Donald Hoffman, but he speaks as well to this idea.
What he proposes is, based on his cognitive models and his computer models and his simulations, is that organisms that see any aspect of reality as it is go extinct in just a few generations, whereas organisms that see reality as a fitness icon designed to help them reproduce thrive. So in other words, there is no bottle of water here as such. There's no water, there's no atoms, there's no paper, there's none of that. This is a graphical user interface that I as a human have evolved to see to help me survive. I see something wet that I know that if I drink it, I will not die. And so we have this shorthand hack in how we see the world. And over and over, he gives examples of insects who will go extinct having sex with a beer bottle because it's perfectly hacked their interface to look like a female insect. And these male insects in Australia, these beetles, will have sex with this bottle to the exclusion of beautiful females nearby because it is so perfect. This has been hacked in advertising with humans to make things look hyper appealing. Any McDonald's ad where they're opening the burger and you see the juicy cheese and all that. By the way, the vegans hate us, don't they? And all that's designed to hack our interface. And his theory is the interface theory of perception, that every species sees reality through a series of evolved hacks that allow us to reproduce. And so here's the punchline of that. What is reality? Is there a reality? And what he argues is, yes, there is. There is an objective reality. It's not, we're all not just making this up. Our visual cortex isn't just constructing it. It's not something where, and he's looked at, the number of neurons in the visual cortex is way more than it takes to reconstruct an image, but just enough to construct an image. So we are constructing the world second to second in our minds every day. But the question is, based on what? And if you look, he then digs into quantum mechanics, and I read his manuscript of the book that he hasn't released yet. In quantum mechanics, they've pretty clearly established that there is no such thing as local realism. In other words, something doesn't exist until it's interacting with a conscious observer. It's a probability wave. So the moon maybe doesn't exist until conscious entities interface with it. But what is it that we're interfacing with? And this is what, when he described this in a TED Talk, and then I read his stuff and I had him on the show, I was convinced it felt intuitively correct to me. I want to see how you feel. You may say it's bullshit. The world is actually nothing but consciousness subdivided into things he calls conscious agents, which are little subdivisions of consciousness that sum up and break down, kind of the way you can have a 1-bit conscious agent. And all a conscious agent is it's a simple mathematical function, and he has the formulas to kind of show this, how they interact with each other and how they sum. The smallest 1-bit conscious agent is a Planck length thing, the smallest thing you can imagine, that can have 3 things. It can perceive, it can decide, and it can act. And the currency of reality is experience. It's conscious experience, from the tiniest levels all the way down, all the way to the largest structures that we have. And so when we try to explain the consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. How does the brain, how does this 3 pounds of wet goo create the experience of me seeing Peter in his cool racing hat with his kind of sexy stubble, which I wish I had? Yeah, it's an icon, but I like it. I'm going to call it mycon because I want it. How does it create that experience, the smell of baking, bread? And the answer is we've been going about it wrong. We have to invoke a miracle in our current understanding. How do we go from atoms, neurons, to experience? Well, at some point, there's a jump that no one has been able to explain. You can wave hands.
Yep.
What he's saying is, how about you start with the miracle, which is everything is awareness and consciousness. And matter and neurons are icons that we use in a species-specific way to understand this vast network of the social network of consciousness interacting with itself.